Failing forward is the topic that we'll be discussing today.
Failing forward is the idea that we have to talk about failure or we're never going to improve. If we don't confront failure, if we're not willing to admit that something went wrong, we're doomed to repeat it. You cannot assume you know all the answers. No matter what your life experience is, no matter how many schools you went to, no matter how many degrees you have, you don't know all of the things. Get humble fast. Be ready to change. The Failing Forward blog would never have lasted this long if we were just repeating the same ones over and over and we weren't learning or taking action. It would have been incredibly boring. But that means you have to be ready to adapt. When something's not working, you have to be willing to try something new.
Welcome everybody to a new episode of the Social Impact Journal. I'm your host as ever, Jack Farron, and this is the podcast where we talk to the change makers around the world driving social impact. This week, I'm joined by Emily Janoch. Emily is the Associate Vice President for Thought Leadership and Design at Care International, and also the host of the Care Failing Forward podcast, which is a really cool podcast that started in 2018. And Emily, I think it's on a bi-weekly basis, or how often do you have episodes?
We aim for twice a month. Sometimes we have gaps depending on what's happening in the schedule, but usually twice a month.
Fantastic. So thanks, Emily, so much for coming on the show. Failing forward is the topic that we'll be discussing today. And I want to first understand what that means.
Failing forward is the idea that we have to talk about failure or we're never going to improve. If we don't confront failure, if we're not willing to admit that something went wrong, we're doomed to repeat it. And this was really inspired by some conversations I was having with colleagues where informally one of them was recounting something they were in the middle of doing that didn't work at all. And the person said, "Oh, I did exactly the same thing with exactly the same partners 2 years ago and had exactly the same experience." And I thought, oh, we can do better than this. But the only way we can do better is if we're willing to admit that what we're doing now doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, not just in the international development space, but, in all sectors, failure is a difficult thing to talk about, either your individual failure or as an organization. What do you see in the sector after 6 years of running the podcast and speaking to many people across the world? Do people feel like they can talk about failure, or is there that block?
It makes a real difference where people are, both where they are physically, but also where they are inside their own organizations. And we obviously aren't the first people to have an idea about failing forward. We borrowed a lot of thinking from NASA, who did some similar work that was all internal. Lots of people have done things like this. And part of what we've learned is you have to think about how can you frame it as, what did you learn from the failure? What happened next? People are really uncomfortable to talk about the failure they're in the middle of and they have no solution for it. But the one that they say, oh, at least I see a path forward now, those are the ones where we're really going to learn the most.
Fantastic. So take me back to 2018. So you're with Care International and you have an idea for a podcast. Or was it officially a podcast at the start, or was it a different medium? How did it all get started?
So we were actually talking, a couple of friends and I, about how interesting it would be to do something like this. And we were thinking about a webinar series. And so we tried, and we did pull off one webinar, and we had a lot of people talking on the webinar. I think we had 4 or 5 guests to sit together for the webinar. And we got to the end of it, and there were 2 main conclusions. One was that scheduling was really challenging. And the other was that the failures people chose to speak about were actually not great. And the only way I can describe that is that they were talking about failures that were either so obvious. So one was talking about a previous organization he'd worked for where somebody had stolen a lot of money. And it's like, well, lesson learned, don't steal. And obviously he wasn't the person who he had sort of had to come in and clean up the mess, but it didn't really tell us anything about what we do next, because that's a failure everybody understands. That's not a failure, that's fraud. And other people really struggled with this idea of how do I tell a story that leads to action? And so they were I think they were very uncomfortable because it was such a big audience, and they sort of felt really on the spot. So we weren't able to schedule a second one. We'd been planning to have a whole series. We weren't able to schedule a second one. And then we thought, well, maybe we'll do written stories. Maybe we'll do like short, social media posts or something like that. And we couldn't get anybody to contribute. And finally, I just started tracking people down and saying, well, you just talk to me and I'll record it and then I'll post it in public. And somehow that was easier for people. The idea that it was just a conversation with me and I was going to ask them a couple of questions, and that there was a chance if they misspoke that we could edit that out. that somehow people got a lot more comfortable as opposed to sitting in a room full of people announcing a failure.
Wow. So you decided then to start this podcast. So when you were speaking and having those chats with the very first individuals, when you told them that you were going to post it publicly and it was not anonymous, that they were going to say what their name is and their organization's name, what were their first reactions?
Almost everybody said, okay, great, which surprised me. I wasn't
Wow.
expecting to get a lot of yeses. I will say I was very selective about who I talked to right at the beginning. So we had a couple of strategies. One was to go to people we knew might be interested. So not to just wallpaper everybody in the organization with an ask, but to be pretty targeted in who we asked. And one of the things we started doing early, and we absolutely borrowed this from NASA, was starting at the top. So getting at senior leaders in different parts of the organization on the idea that then later, if you went to somebody more junior, they couldn't say, oh, well, I'm not allowed to do this, because you could say your boss did it, it's okay. And part of what happened, one of them even told me, one of the early interviewees, he said, well, the email started with, you're a leader at CARE, and I think this would be important for you to set the tone. I'm not sure how to say no to that.
Yeah, so the early episodes were all within internal staff at CARE International.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic, initiative as an organization to say, let's talk about our failures. And was the initial objective of the podcast for CARE staff to listen in and learn, or for the wider public as well?
It was originally very much targeted for CARE staff, but because of the way the platform worked, they had to be public. We weren't really expecting a lot of non-CARE people to listen to them, but having that audio storytelling was something people were really resonating with, and being able to play it on their own schedule. They didn't have to wait for a webinar. They didn't have to figure out what time zone. They could just play whenever they were interested in. But we didn't really expect a lot of people to engage outside of CARE. And we were very much thinking about, what do people who have to implement programs need to hear?
Yeah, so 2018 was the first podcast. I know it was with a gentleman from CARE UK, and you were looking at how Ebola taught us to take risks and make fast decisions. So what were your questions in that first episode? What were you thinking about asking?
So there's a couple of things, and our question list has actually stayed relatively stable over time. One of the things we always ask is, tell us about the context, because something that failed where you are might work really well somewhere else, or there might be something about that context people need to know. And then also really focusing on, what did you do next? So yes, you want to understand the failure. We always ask what went wrong, but we really wanted to make sure we left people with somewhere to go. So it isn't just a story of, nope, this doesn't work, too bad, but really thinking about, what do we learn from it? How do we react? And then Andreas, he was the first one. He was incredible and very gracious. And he talked about things we'd never expected. So that idea of, the failure was that we didn't take enough risks, not that we'd taken too many, right? Or that we moved too slow, not that we moved too fast. And that really helped us set the tone for how we worked with everyone afterwards.
Okay, so I'd love to hear maybe 2 episodes that have really stuck with you or have had a big impact with your audience, and some of the answers that they provided.
Yeah. So our most listened to episode ever is called Why White Feminism Has Failed. And I really have to give a huge amount of credit to one of my colleagues, who was our head of international gender programming at the time, in the wake of the George Floyd murder, who was willing to talk about this idea of international development, and particularly the gender, women's equality part of international development, and how that that absolutely is not as inclusive as it should be. And it's driven by a very particular lens and needs to be more open than that. And part of what made that so resonate so much was, of course, the topic and the timing. And part of it was her absolute vulnerability and her willingness to be honest about something that's really hard. And that really resonated for people, that telling a story that's a true story, that is part of your own self. It's not just a technical, this thing broke, or, we got that one part of the document wrong, but something that's really about your own identity really resonated for people. The other favorite that I have is called A Year of Listening, and it's about the first time CARE started working with social movements in Latin America. And one of my most respected colleagues, Sophia Spreckman, who's our Secretary General, and she's an absolutely incredible leader, talked about what it was like when CARE decided we were going to do that, and walking into the room, assuming something about our own power and our own place, and being completely wrong. And she said, I spent a whole year getting metaphorically slapped in the face and being told, you're doing it wrong, think differently. And what it takes to spend a year doing that and come out having changed the way you behave is pretty incredible.
So those are two episodes that our listeners can definitely tune into. What are the major platforms you're using for the Care Failing Forward podcast?
So we use Podbean, that's where we post. And then we're also on Apple Podcasts, and we're also on Spotify.
Okay, amazing. So moving aside from the work that Care International and you were doing in terms of communicating failure, are there any other organizations in this space that you think are doing a really good job about sharing their stories?
Engineers Without Borders has actually been doing it for longer than we have. I don't know if they do a podcast exactly, but they put out a failure report. They talk about this are things that we tried that didn't work. And part of what's really important about that, Engineers Without Borders, among other things, does a lot of work on water systems. And the statistics around water systems around the world are not very good. Most water systems around the world fail without intensive investments. And I grew up in Michigan. Flint, Michigan is a poster child for how that happens. And so they're very transparent because they know it's a problem for the whole sector. BRAC also has recently come out with a failure report from 2022 and 2023, and they've been really thoughtful about what do we learn, what do we see, how do we change from here? And they're all grounded in this idea that our most important goal is not looking good. Our most important goal is delivering the impact we say we're in it for, and we can't do that unless we embrace failure.
For sure. So you've got the Care, Engineers Without Borders, and BRAC. If you're now talking to the leaders of other social impact organizations, what would you tell them and advise to how to embrace, an internal culture about failure, about communicating failure?
There are a few things, and it's interesting because I talk to other organizations about this a lot. And one of the first questions I always get is, how come you haven't been fired yet? And I don't actually have an answer to that question. But if you're asking me that question, that means your organization is not quite there yet. There is something about that primacy of impact, of putting impact before everything else, but having that be the core. And then you don't really have a choice except to embrace failure, because otherwise what you're doing is mostly window dressing. So that's part of it. Another one is that you really do have to start at the top. You have to have people high up in the organization ready to embrace this, ready to do it publicly. I said to our CEO when she did a few episodes in, she did one, and I said, I'm going to post this on the internet. Is that okay? And she said, of course, why not? That says something about the kind of organization you're in. And we do have a few rules on the podcast. Do no harm is the biggest one. So we have to make sure that we're really respectful about the people we work with and that we're not putting anybody at risk. And the other one is you're not allowed to blame anybody else. You have to own the failure. And those are really the only two rules. Everything else goes. And creating a space where people are willing to engage in that conversation and that they're not penalized for it. One of the things I started doing very early on is when people would participate, I would send a note to their boss and I would copy them. And I would say, your person just did an amazing job. I really appreciate their time and their expertise. Can you share it with your whole team? And so watching it start to flow out into the organization that way really made a difference.
You touched on earlier, and I think you just mentioned there that you interviewed the CEO very early on in the podcast series. How important was that to, number one, build credibility around the show, but number two, give you the flexibility then to talk to other Care staff, to welcome, to invite them on as a guest?
It was important. And it's one that people still come back to me and say, I listened to that one. Michelle, who's our CEO, also just did the 100th episode with us. So she's come back and done it again. And people do listen to those, there's something really important about the head of the organization signaling it. The other thing I learned, and no disrespect to our CEO, is that you had to get the mid layers of management involved too. Because, well, she's the CEO, she can say whatever she wants, is a little bit different than my immediate boss thinks it's a good idea. And so getting those middle layers of management became really important. I don't think that was the right first step. I think starting with very senior leaders was the right first step, but we did have to then sort of engage other leaders or people who hold different kinds of leadership in the organization over time.
Fantastic. So before we move away from the podcast, are you looking for guests? How do you get new guests on? And if someone is listening to the Social Impact Journal here that thinks, do you know what? There's a failure that I want to talk about. How can they get in touch with you?
We have evolved over time. So it used to be just care staff. Now we interview people from all different places, different industries. It's still primarily in international development, but I always love to learn from different sectors too. So just get in touch. You can find me on LinkedIn. My contact information is on the podcast. We would love to feature that. And one of the things I've found really powerful is when it's people from different sectors or who come in with a different angle, there's so much that we do in common, but we don't talk about the same way. And so we learn almost more from the external folks than we do from our own.
Okay, great. So let's talk about the topic of localization. I know this is an area that you're doing a lot of work on, and that you've touched on in discussions on your podcast. So from the discussions you've had and what you've learned, what is the importance of centering local voices in these discussions?
There are a few things. One is that our own assumptions about what a failure is, both what has failed and what has worked, are not always at all reflective of the people who are living through the problem. And there's a blog we posted about 18 months ago now, where this was with local partners. We did a survey with care staff saying, what do you think care needs to change? We did a different survey with partners. It was the same questions, but partners answered. We did not answer the same at all. Right? They had very different answers about what we needed to do differently than we thought ourselves. And oddly enough, I've repeated that survey with other INGOs when I'm talking to them about it. They almost always answer the same way care does. So there is something about when we reinforce each other instead of listening to the people we're working with, that we build something that feels like the right answer and might not reflect their truth at all. It also means we find much better solutions when we talk to communities, because they see problems in different ways because they live with them every day. And so things that sound like they will work when I'm sitting in Washington, D.C. may or may not work there. And what is going to work, I'll never think of because I'm not a part of it. And so a big part of how we need to do this work differently is to understand that we can help people, we can connect to people, we can support people. We can't solve their problems for them. A woman I was speaking to named Zemzem in Ethiopia last year said to me, I want to be really clear, this is not your success, this is my success. This is not CARE's success, this is my success. You showed me the path, I'm the one who took it. And that's what you want to see happen in the world. But that does mean we have to take ourselves out of the center of the story.
Absolutely. I'm really interested about this survey that you conducted with staff and with partners. Would you be able to share maybe a few questions that were in that survey, just to have an understanding of what was being asked?
Yeah, so we were specifically focused on operations and financial management. So people have told us, local partners have told us for years, they call us care of 1,000 papers, that really our processes are too heavy. There's just a lot of paperwork involved. It can be pretty frustrating, especially if you're in the middle of a humanitarian response where everything should be going pretty quickly. And so we set a list of possibilities of things we could change, or that we thought we could change relatively quickly. What would be some quick wins there? And we said, which of these do you want to prioritize? And it was a very, very nuts and bolts operational kind of list. Things like, well, we could give you 2 time periods worth of finance at the same time instead of only 1 at a time. So we could give you a little bit more money front loaded. We could let you have small mistakes in your reporting, not fraud, but typos and other small errors, and still release the next set of funding to you. So it was that kind of thinking. And it was really interesting that the care people just didn't select the same things. Partners told us, we want the money sooner. We want you to calm down about typos in our reports. And they also had some real questions about how currency conversion worked that we hadn't even considered. And so it was just really striking to see that if we had gone ahead with our own assumptions, we would have been totally wrong.
And I know a few weeks ago in July 2024, you co-authored a blog on the USAID website named Where Rubber Hits the Road. And I think this was related to some other studies that you've done with care and some failures. So would you be able to talk about some of the elements that you included in that blog?
Yeah. And that was actually the follow-up. So we'd gotten in January of 2023, we'd gotten this feedback from partners very specifically. And as I say, it's not that we didn't know before, we had some challenges, but getting really specific about what are things we can do. And so we'd been working on that and hits and misses. And then we do a survey with somebody called Keystone Accountability, which again, surveys partners, and it's an external body that surveys them to say what's working and what's not. And there were 2 things that were really interesting about that. One is that overall, we were still scoring lower than we wanted to in some of those operational areas, but there was a small set of country offices that were scoring much higher than average. So we said, well, what are they doing that's working if it's not working everywhere else? What's happening there? And some of the things aren't that surprising. Work in partnership with partners, of course, right? Don't just tell them what you need them to do, actually treat them like real partners. So those are, I think, pretty expected. Some of the ones that were surprising was having a much more diverse kind of partnership. So if we were only partnering with civil society organizations, we were actually getting lower scores across the board than if we partnered with civil society organizations and private sector and government. And it wasn't that the other partners just scored us higher. It was that working with more than one kind of partner forced us to become more flexible. The other big surprise, I think, was looking at what was the percentage of women in leadership in the organization was one of the common factors of where people were scoring higher. And it was something about, we think when we talk to people, it's something about, that's one of CARE's core principles is around equality, and watching us model that ourselves gave people a lot more faith in the work we were doing.
Fantastic. Well, Emily, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the show. If you have a page and you're writing this now for an organization that maybe has not really embraced, communicating internal failure, but are looking at how to do that, what would you write in that page for them to read?
A couple things on the page. The first one has to start with humility, and it comes up with guests on my podcast over and over. You cannot assume you know all the answers, no matter what your life experience is, no matter how many schools you went to, no matter how many degrees you have, you don't know all of the things. Get humble fast. Really build listening skills. It's one of the most important things. And in the blog we published about The Rubber Hits the Road, those soft skills, learn to listen for people and learn to listen to what they're not saying to you. Where is that sort of awkward gap in the conversation? And then the last one is be ready to change. The Failing Forward blog would never have lasted this long if we were just repeating the same ones over and over and we weren't learning or taking action. It would have been incredibly boring. But that means you have to be ready to adapt when something's not working. You have to be willing to try something new.
Fantastic. Great insights. And I think this is going to be really helpful for our audience here. So if you want to connect with Emily, her LinkedIn is in the show notes, along with the link to the Failing Forward podcast. Emily, thanks so much again for coming on the show.
Thanks, Jack. It's been a real honor to be here.